carbon removal can be an opportunity for communities across the US to find new ways to apply some of the skill sets that they've developed in the past, in many cases in the fossil fuel industry, and apply those towards carbon removal projects that are much better aligned with a net zero economy of the future.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Our guest today is Noah Deich, Senior Advisor at the US Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, or FECM. Noah, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's an honor to have you. Before we dive headfirst into all the exciting initiatives of the FECM, I was wondering if we could get a little bit of your backstory, starting with you co-founding Carbon180, climate NGO narrowly focused on carbon removal, and then how you ended up working at the Department of Energy.
Yeah, thanks, Violet. Very excited to be here. Thank you for the invite. And it's a long and winding road, to be honest. I did not expect that I would be working on carbon removal from the beginning. I initially was working on clean energy projects around the time of the Waxman-Markey cap and trade legislation. And I saw how impactful the failure of that legislation to turn into law was on the action of companies at the time. It seemed like everyone thought it was inevitable that there would be climate legislation, and then all of a sudden that came crashing down. And instead of figuring out how to continue decarbonizing, but through a different means, most businesses that I was working with at the time, large energy companies, big Fortune 500s and their sustainability offices, seemed to go into wait and see mode. And they all put on hold most of their more ambitious decarbonization plans. And so I just had the naive question at the time of, well, if we're not going to decarbonize as quickly as we all need to, as we thought we were going to, do we need to also clean up the carbon that not just continues to be put into the atmosphere, but remains there from past emissions? And I say it's a naive question because I don't have a science background. I just was genuinely curious about if this is something that we needed. I'd never heard about it before. And it just so turns out that the science community was, I would say fairly quietly, but pretty resoundingly determining, yes, we absolutely will need to, unless emissions fall at a pace that nobody thinks is possible, especially with what we've seen from the politics of climate change to date. And so that was my real introduction to carbon removal. And the organization that I helped found, Carbon180, was designed really just to explore that basic question initially, which is, do we need carbon removal? So how much? What types of solutions hold the greatest promise? And really try and dig into the academics, but bring that conversation outside of the academy and into the more mainstream policy and business conversations that I felt I had been a part of previously, but just had never heard of this topic before. And so that's really what brought me to the Department of Energy, is we very quickly realized that in order for carbon removal to scale, it's not like many of these other clean energy technologies that have a natural market, that in some ways you follow the same innovation pathway of solar and wind and electric vehicles, and you need to just get started and you build at small scale. It costs a lot initially, but the more that you build, the cheaper it gets, and that creates this positively reinforcing learning curve. But the big difference is that people want electricity, people want cars, people want everything that we have today just clean, except there isn't this demand for carbon removal where people are already willing to pay for it. It's just a question of how do you do it differently? You have to fundamentally create this market as well. And so that's why policy is so important in this field. It's not just how do you catalyze innovation, but it's how do you actually create the market for these technologies and these solutions in the long run. And we really focused on policy change at the time. And I think it was amazing to see Congress respond to the moment when the bipartisan infrastructure law passed, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, that we see so many key fundamental policies that are supporting the carbon removal industry today, that it's just a real honor and privilege to be able to work here at DOE as we implement so many of those policies and figure out how to turn these ideas that we know are going to be important from the policy lens into programs that are really going to have the impact on the ground of building projects that are going to be foundational and catalytic for the field as it grows into an industry over the coming decades.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, Noah, I'd like to ask you if you could please also share with us more of what the FECM's efforts to support carbon removal include.
Sure. So the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office is an office that's been working on carbon management broadly for decades at this point. It started in an exploration of dedicated geologic storage of CO2 and figuring out what the opportunity of that was in the United States, and then very quickly evolved to figuring out how we could adapt the technology that had been developed to separate CO2 from other industrial processes, largely in the oil and gas industry, into a climate technology that could be used to capture and then transport and store CO2 associated with the existing fossil energy industry, both in the power sector, which was the initial focus on coal and then natural gas, but also in the heavy industrial sector, which makes up a quarter to a third of US emissions, depending on how you slice it. And many of those industrial processes are very, very difficult to decarbonize without carbon capture. And so there's been a broad expansion of that program to look at those sources. Carbon removal is really one of the new evolutions of that program. So in the past maybe 3 or 4 years, it's really expanded to not just focus on the geologic storage and the point source carbon capture, but also to think broadly about carbon removal and atmospheric carbon removal. And it focused on this guiding principle that our secretary announced a few years ago called the carbon negative shot. The carbon negative shot is this all hands on deck call for innovation on carbon removal. It's pathway agnostic. It doesn't say it's a direct air capture program or a biomass carbon removal program. It doesn't actually name solutions. It just says any type of technology or pathway that can scale to reduce the cost of carbon removal to below $100 a ton all in and get us on the pathway to gigaton scale within a decade is in scope. And so we're really pursuing this portfolio approach to the greatest extent that we have the money and the flexibility to do so, to try and advance technologies across the full carbon removal portfolio to scale. And it's not just the technology innovation and piloting that we're focused on here. There's a big effort that we're undertaking in order to develop the technology and associated standards and protocols for measuring, reporting, and verifying carbon removal outcomes, which we see as really critical. And in no other industry is the measurement, reporting, and verification as critical as carbon removal in my mind, because the only asset that you are generating is the carbon outcome. And that's a fundamentally intangible product in most cases. You're accepting a carbon credit or some other certificate that what you're doing is removing the carbon from the atmosphere. Credibility is the product. And so investing in both sides of that equation, both the technology itself and the measurement, reporting, and verification pieces of it are where DOE is focusing and what our office is investing in. I'll also say that it's not just the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office working on carbon removal. It's a truly all hands on deck approach here at DOE. We collaborate with colleagues on the biomass technology side, in the water power office for ocean and marine carbon removal. We work with colleagues in national labs and our policy office as we think about the measurement, reporting, and verification aspects of this. So we're working across the applied innovation spectrum, and not just at an early technology readiness level, which is DOE's historic sweet spot in terms of innovation support, but we work very closely with the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations and the Loan Programs Office to make sure that once technology has matured past the, I'll call it small pilot scale, that there is the innovation support to get it not just to market, but then past all of those technology hurdles and to overcome some of the commercialization barriers that hold technology back from really gaining market adoption. So it's an all hands on deck approach to supporting this carbon negative shot today at DOE.
Excellent. Now, since you mentioned supporting both sides of the equation, I'm curious as to how that applies to supply and demand, as I know that the FECM also has an initiative called the Voluntary Carbon Dioxide Removal Purchase Challenge. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about what that is and how it works.
Yeah, of course. And that's a different equation. I think historically, DOE has largely supported supply side efforts. How do we provide grants and other forms of cost share so that the early of a kind technology demonstrations cost less to the investor at the end of the day? That's very much where our focus continues to be if you look at the dollars out the door on our end. But I think we have some small and really important programs on the demand side. Notably, we have a pilot program for actually purchasing carbon removal credits ourselves. I believe it's the first government program to do that directly in terms of the credit purchases. And we think that that's going to be a really critical signal to the market to how to actually engage with some of these early stage innovations and early startups in having high quality carbon credits that can scale into the future. And so we announced the 24 semifinalists for this $35 million program last week. We are going to down select to 10 finalists that are then going to be able to win up to $3 million each when they deliver the carbon removal according to the measurement, reporting, and verification plans that are agreed on in that final round. And what we're doing is we're really bringing the best that DOE has to offer in terms of technical evaluation capacity. DOE, the national labs, external experts like Carbon Direct helped us with this evaluation. So we're bringing an incredibly diverse and powerful mind share to this program. And what we hope to do is more or less open source that. We want to share what our evaluations with the world and say, hey, DOE has looked at these companies and we think they have a great shot at delivering high quality carbon removal in the near future. Because we know that at the end of the day, carbon removal projects are capital intensive. That a $3 million award from DOE is not going to buy a full-scale commercial direct air capture facility, not going to enable the full-scale CO2 mineralization or the ocean carbon removal approaches. It's going to require a lot more capital, which is where the voluntary carbon market comes into play. We know that the voluntary carbon market is increasingly supporting carbon removal technologies, and we've been really excited to see how fast that field is growing. But at the same time, it still needs to increase by orders of magnitude compared to where it is today to actually get carbon removal solutions across that commercial liftoff threshold. And we think that's possible. We think that there's a lot of interest from companies today, but there are a lot of barriers that DOE is hoping to solve. One of those barriers is exactly on the technical side, is that while DOE has a large bench of technical experts at headquarters at national labs and beyond, that's not always the case in a carbon offset purchasing shop from a Fortune 500 company, for example. So what we hope to do is really provide, enable those companies to look at what we did as a starting place for their own evaluations and have confidence that we're providing that technical rigor in our own evaluations. And what we hope to do is use that to get more folks purchasing carbon removal at small and growing scales. And that's where this voluntary carbon removal purchasing challenge really comes in. We're not being specific in the challenge and saying you have to buy our credits. Of course, we think they offer a great starting place, But what we really want to do is encourage all of the companies out there that are looking to buy carbon credits today to expand what they're doing, both in terms of the amount of purchasing that they're doing, as well as the types of credits they're buying. Because in many cases, the historic offsets that have been purchased are not carbon removal, but are emission avoidance. And I think what we really see on the carbon removal side is a chance for these credits to be really high integrity in terms of their additionality and their permanence. And we're optimistic that by investing in these earlier stage innovation efforts today, that they'll be able to get to commercialization and offer a really significant supply to the voluntary carbon markets in a way that's going to boost the field for everybody into the future. And that's really important to us because the US government as a whole just committed to advance high integrity carbon markets. We issued a set of principles, both on the supply and the demand side of purchasing carbon credits. And we think it's a really critical way to drive climate finance into high impact climate projects. And carbon removal is just one of the ways that we think that this can accelerate the market overall and be a real tailwind for the field. Really enable corporates who want to do the right thing and want to be ambitious on their decarbonization, have a meaningful and significant impact on mitigating some of the emissions that they don't control directly in their supply chain and are just very difficult for them to directly reduce in the near term.
Thank you, Noah. Circling back to the semifinalists of the CDR Purchase Pilot Prize, would you mind telling us a little bit more about some of these companies and how you feel about their prospects?
Yeah, of course. So in our portfolio of semifinalists, we actually have a very wide range of companies. We have some direct air capture companies. We have some biomass carbon removal companies. We have some CO2 mineralization companies. We have some ocean CDR companies. And I think that diversity is really a strength of the field. That at the end of the day, we don't think there is going to be a silver bullet carbon removal technology. We think there are going to be lots of carbon removal technologies that end up showing promise and are going to work well in different geographies. And that's exactly what our program is showing, that there are certainly some carbon removal companies in places like Texas and Louisiana where you might expect and have heard other DOE announcements, for example, on carbon removal projects in the past. But we also have California, Arkansas, the Northeast. It's a really distributed set of projects. And I think it really shows that carbon removal can be an opportunity for communities across the US to find new ways to apply some of the skill sets that they've developed in the past, in many cases in the fossil fuel industry, and apply those towards carbon removal projects that are much better aligned with a net zero economy of the future. And they can really be on the frontier of pioneering these solutions in a way that's going to be important, not just in the US, but absolutely lead in the global effort to hit net zero and then potentially beyond into net negative territory in the coming decades. And so that's really exciting that we have such a breadth of technologies and geographies. And what I'll also say is that within each of those verticals, there's a significant diversity of technologies themselves. We were very intentional to make sure that we were not picking a specific technology configuration as the one winner today, because we think, again, there's strength in diversity. Direct air capture is a great example where we have lots of different approaches across the direct air capture technology tree. And what we want to do is make sure that we're not locking in any one of those technology approaches prematurely. Same thing on the biomass side. I think it's a great example. Historically, when people thought about biomass carbon removal, it was really bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, thinking about how you would apply conventional point source carbon capture on the back of a biomass power plant or other type of industrial facility. And while we certainly have some of those tech in our portfolio, we also have folks that are completely reconceptualizing what biomass carbon removal can look like. Some folks that are burying bio oil associated with biomass production. Others that are literally just burying the biomass, extracting another value-added product, but are focusing exclusively on the carbon value associated with the waste biomass. And so I think it's very important that we're supporting this diversity of solutions. And I hope that the market also responds by supporting a wide range of carbon removal technologies as we go forward, so that we have a good and healthy competition, not just now, but far into the future as we scale carbon removal.
And with that said, what can participants expect from phase 2 of the competition to be like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're going to formally release the rules shortly. So I'll save the specifics for once the rules are out, but that will be available for everyone. I think what is important now is that we've reviewed the detailed concept papers that the folks have submitted to select our semifinalists. Now the semifinalists are going to come back and produce it's effectively a carbon removal purchasing contract that will detail all of the specifications for how they plan to deliver carbon removal credits to DOE at the end of the project. And so that's where we're going to get into the real brass tacks about what types of measurement, reporting, and verification are they going to do? Where are the details about the projects, not just from the technology and the team side, but also the community benefits pieces of this. And so it's really going to flesh out what these projects are going to look like on the ground, so that we know exactly what we are getting when that carbon removal it starts to be operationalized, and that we start to get the submissions back to us to say, hey, we did this carbon removal. It was verified in the way that we all agreed. Now we would like our money in exchange for the carbon credit associated with this work. And so it's really going to move from more high-level concepts into the brass tacks of how do we actually contract with suppliers for carbon removal. And we think that this is really important as a baseline for what the field can look like going forward. We know that there aren't internationally recognized standards across carbon removal as a whole, let alone some of the individual approaches that are emerging and innovating rapidly. And so what we really want to do with this effort is to benchmark where those standards for measurement, reporting, and verification are today, and what some of the standard contract terms can look like that both support the industry and enable innovators to get the capital that they need and scale their projects, while also ensuring that the purchasers have the confidence that the carbon removal that they get at the end of the day is in fact what is built. We very much want to avoid a situation where we're paying for carbon removal that we only learned far into the future didn't actually happen, did happen and then reversed, or didn't happen at the level that we thought it would. And so I think it's really important to chart out both sides of this equation for the buyers and the suppliers about what a high quality contract looks like. And it starts to get very technical and wonky in nature. But I think that's a really good and healthy place for where the field is, and will enable the field to mature and actually do what we need to do, which is get large amounts of capital moving into carbon removal projects so that the innovation can happen at the scale it needs to start driving down costs and start to make the impact on the climate that we really want.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Noah, to slightly move away from all these really great and really helpful initiatives, I was curious to get your take on a specific carbon removal pathway, namely direct air capture. Solely from a funding perspective, it does seem like DAC is getting a lion's share of the DOE's attention. So I was curious as to what you believe the reason for that is.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. That when you look at the dollars out the door, that DOE is funding billions more in the direct air capture space than in the other carbon removal spaces. That's entirely a function of Congress directing DOE on how to spend our funding across the carbon removal portfolio. And it's something that we are eager to work with Congress to increase the funding for the other pillars of the carbon removal equation in order to make it not just the direct air capture technologies that have the funding to get to commercial scale demonstration and then beyond, but it's all of these avenues that hold promise. And so you'll see in our carbon negative shot materials that we, again, are very focused on this portfolio approach. We want to enable lots of these different pathways to emerge across lots of different geographies. But at the end of the day, Congress decides how much money we get to spend on carbon removal and where we focus that investment. And so where those direct air capture investments are really coming from is that direct direction from Congress to only fund the large scale commercial demonstrations in the direct air capture space and leaving the smaller pilots to be CDR technology agnostic. I am very optimistic that the legislation that we are seeing in Congress emerge is more technology agnostic. There are pieces of legislation like the CREST Act, for example, that would increase the amount of CDR purchasing that the Department of Energy would do. Those bills all are fairly technology agnostic and reflect the diversity of technologies that we're supporting. And I think there certainly is interest in figuring out how we can expand that portfolio over time. So I think it's really just a reflection of where the initial funding came from. And I hope that over time, DOE will be able to expand its support for the full portfolio of not just carbon removal pilots and smaller scale projects, but that full commercial scale suite as well.
Lovely. Noah, are there any other exciting new updates or other initiatives that the FECM has lined up for the future that you're ready to speak to?
Well, I would just call to note that we do have funding for a wide range of those smaller pilots. We announced a carbon negative shot funding opportunity that focused on smaller scale carbon removal projects. We have funding for more direct air capture, small pilots that will be announced soon. And we are working as part of an interagency task force on the marine carbon removal space and are eager to fund more projects in that space as funding becomes available. And so what I think you'll see from the department over the coming months and years is a continued support at small scale for a wide variety of carbon removal projects, and eagerness to work with both Congress to get more money for our own projects, but also partnership opportunities with the private sector, because we know that, like the rest of the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act, this is going to be government funded, but industry led, and we need industry leaders to step up. And so we're just eager to continue conversations, and our door is open for the corporate and investor leaders that want to expand their work in supporting carbon removal innovation, whether it's through the projects directly or through the carbon removal credit purchases. We're just eager for that collaboration and encourage folks to reach out if we can be helpful.
Great. Now, for my final question before we wrap up this episode, as someone who really has a bird's eye view over this whole emerging industry, what is your outlook for the future of CDR?
That's a great question. And I think in the near term, it's very bright. The technology innovation that I see gives me enormous hope that we will solve this equation from a technical perspective, that we're going to have a diversity of solutions emerge. I wish I could tell you which ones those were going to be, but I have the humility to know that is not something that I will be able to predict with any accuracy. It's just this portfolio approach that gives me the most optimism that we'll be able to solve it from a technical perspective. The real challenge that I see is how do we actually develop the policy and markets to scale the solutions that do end up working in the 2030 plus timeframe? That this isn't like some of those other technologies where there is $1 trillion market for electricity and cars and so forth globally. And so there's this huge pie to shoot for if you're a technology innovator in some of those other clean tech spaces. We have to create that. And I think shifting the mindset from policymakers that it's a one-time innovation push and then we're off to the races when it comes to carbon removal, and that we need the support in a continued way to provide the right incentives and mandates and other types of policy vehicles to really scale carbon removal is something that's really critical. And that's where I think the private sector can play such an important role, is that every carbon removal purchase today stands to make impact far beyond the direct emissions that it reduces, but in the ability to communicate that we need carbon removal and that everybody needs to step up to do a small and growing amount of work in this space today. And if we're able to do that, and I'm optimistic that we can, I think the future is really bright. But if we think this is, hey, we did this amazing once in a generation policy effort here in the US, and now the work is done, as opposed to that was an essential down payment, but now we need to figure out how to pay the mortgage, we're not going to be in a good space. So it's really up to us and to, in many cases, the industry and policy leaders, both here in the US and around the world, to hear that call and step up to the plate and really invest in these technologies in a long-term and sustained way. That's not just going to help show that innovation is possible, but sustain the market and the industry over the long run.
Brilliant. Noah, I'm really happy to be ending the episode on such a positive note. It was a great pleasure to have you as a guest on our podcast today, and thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show, and of course for all the important work you do.
Thank you, Violet, and likewise.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.